Good morning, Heather. Would you like to share a coffee with me today?
Yes, but I've got hot chocolate. Is that okay?
That is fine because I woke up early today, so my
Mm.
coffee at this point is mostly foam, almond milk foam. So that
Coffee
doesn't make
flavored.
us even. Yes, coffee flavored foam.
I would love that actually. Yummy, yummy.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, yeah, I'm so glad that we ran into each other because there's something quite heavy on my mind. And I was remembering a Peter Gelderloos article that he posted on Substack, which I'll link to. And it was, I don't know, beginning of the year maybe. And about midway through the article, he starts well, because the first part of the article, he's summarizing what he's been up to. So please do scroll down to when you get to this bit where he has an extract from his new book, which is called Organization, Continuity, Community, which I'm waiting to arrive because our mutual friend and colleague from Ohio has sent it, and I suspect it will take 3 months to get here to Colombia, and there's no ebook version or anything. I'll link to that as well. But anyway, so he says that he is extracting from it and that it's about community. And he says that in the book, he problematizes the overused concept of community. And that's something that you and I, outside of this podcast, Chris, we work on. We work on building community in the sense that we're trying to meet people's needs for community by building spaces online to create this community. But Peter says here that it's not a community unless your survival depends on it. And he puts a comma there and says, unless you wouldn't be who you are outside of that context. So he says a community is not a group of friends. And maybe we could say it's also not a group of colleagues. And nonetheless, he says friendship is wonderful. But I just want to stop there, even before he goes to the extract in the book, which I won't even go into today. But I just want to stop there with this idea of community and the challenge that he poses to us because I woke up this morning to a breaking news alert about Israel continuing its genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. And then within the last 2 hours, there was another Al Jazeera alert saying that Israel's renewed strikes have killed 183 children in Gaza. And before I connect that to community, I mean, how is this kind of news being normalized? You know, I I've been in contact with people who are from Gaza and had to evacuate or flee within the past year. I've been talking to them in the past 2 weeks. And I'm remembering all the news footage of people walking back to Gaza when the ceasefire was announced. And now 183 children are dead just in the past 24 hours. And how I connect this to what Peter Gelderloos says about community is that, like the idea that a community isn't a community unless your survival depends on it. And that is so literal when we're talking about Gaza and people trying to survive a genocide, how you take care of one another, find food, find medicine, make the GoFundMe's, get people to hospitals, being a foreign doctor living there and helping people. They're part of the community because they're a human being who's living in a genocide zone. And even if they're not Palestinian, their survival depends on the people around them and depends on information and shelter and food. And then when we take this conversation into our context, you live in New York City, Chris. I live in a small town outside of Bogota in Colombia. And it's very peaceful here, even though there is a lot of violence happening in other parts of Colombia right now, including grenades in Bogota between gangs and things like that. But our need for survival, it just feels like a completely different level. Um, And then when he says after the comma, unless you wouldn't be who you are outside of that context. And it really gives me pause because I live a lot of my life online. And I guess a thought experiment would be what would happen if the internet went out? Would I still be who I am? And under what circumstances does it feel like my survival depends on the community around me? Are we talking about shops, the pharmacist that gets me my medicine, the people who take the rubbish away, the people who maintain sewage systems? I mean, all of these people I rely upon for my survival, but they're not part of my community, you know? Like I I'm not in community with these people. I don't know their names. And so to think about what would I need to lose in order to not be who I am, that that's a really that those are two things that I'm thinking about, like what it means to survive and like physically survive, and then what it would mean in terms of my identity to survive. I don't know what comes up for you when you hear all that.
Yeah, toward the end there, you hit upon, and really you offered context that emphasizes the point when you came back and hit upon the comma. The first part in front being survival, and the second part being who you are, and losing the sense of who you are without what Peter Gelderloos is causing community. And I see the distinction between them. Obviously, I can't speak for him. I don't sense that he is saying these two pieces are equivalent, that survival is equivalent to you being who you are. Because, and certainly when I was younger, I used to think repeatedly, oftentimes, and in different realms that I don't need to get into here, I used to think often about what is a need, really? And I think for lack of a better term right now, I think the older me would say there's not necessarily a need to binaritize that which is a need versus that which is quote unquote merely a want. So, as an example, common example, we can't physically survive very long without water. If we have water, we can survive a little bit longer without food. But if we don't have friends, could we survive physically? Yeah. Would it be an enjoyable life? Probably not. So these are the types of things that come to my mind as you talk about a community and the word survival. And yet there's this phrase, being who we are, or losing who we are without this idea of community. I feel like the word survival in our context, as you said, in our context, where compared to the people in Gaza and the people in Sudan and the people in Papua New Guinea and many places around the world, compared to those people, I'd say we're fairly comfortable. But I would not say then that the people in our domain are not our community, because we're not depending on them, let's say for protection, or to pick us up and take us to the hospital, or to pour water down our throat because we can't move. It's very different, but I feel still that it is relevant in our context. So there is a context dependent element of community that I believe is valid. Um, Here in New York City, if I had no one around me, I could probably get by just fine. I've got money, I've got some decent health. I have two arms and two legs and 2 feet and two hands and two eyes and two ears that work, which Not everybody has that, even here. But there's also a whole ecosystem that I rely on, an ecosystem of people that I don't know, I may never see, and you referenced it, your version of it in terms of the people in your community who pick up the trash, for instance, or the people who bring things to the market. So I'm not sure I have really some clarity in terms of a point to make, but I do want to share that these are the images, these are the thoughts that come to my mind when I'm trying to hold in one place this idea of community as survival, this idea of community as making us who we are, and what that really looks like in, shall we say, times like these.
Yeah. I'll go back to what you said about needs because I come from um a I'm part of I was going to say a community, but I don't want to use that word now. I've learned a lot of what I do in my work, in my livelihood. I've learned from a community, which is a community, I believe, the non-violent global community, it's called. Um, and they they are based on nonviolent communication, which is a Marshall Rosenberg um, methodology perspective. And their needs do include things like friendship, like human needs. There's the physical needs, and then there's, like the not so physical needs. And so I think we know that if a baby is just left and only given food but no physical contact, they actually don't survive. So it is a question of, when people feel isolated and lonely, that can lead to health problems, which connects to actual survivability, be they mental health or physical health. So I do believe that these are needs. And yeah, I guess moving away from the challenge it posed around why am I not in community with the people that keep me healthy from the sewers, just, like who deal with sewage and things like that. Like, why aren't I in community with those people? Um, Moving away from that and thinking in terms of the survival of my identity, I still wonder, like, I understand that if I suddenly didn't have any people around, that would challenge my identity because I'm such a, like, I'm not like a person that's only working with data and I just work by myself. Like, my work is very social. I work with people. I'm talking to people all day. I'm coaching. I'm giving workshops. I'm talking to you. We're in meetings. It's very social. If I suddenly didn't have that, like if I was in prison in solitary confinement, I mean, I think I would, sometimes I think I would be okay because I really do enjoy my mind. I'd need paper. I'd need to be able to write. But at some point, I'd want that interaction with another brain that would be reading their books or having letters, like I would really. So I, so for me, I don't know. I'm a mother, but I don't feel like if suddenly she disappeared, I'm not one of those people that would be like empty nest syndrome, Like I just don't have a sense of identity that is so tied into being a mother that I would be like, what, what would I do with my life now that I'm not a mother? Like I would keep doing what I'm doing without that particular relationship, So it's hard for me to, I think it's a great challenge that he poses in the article because he does go on to give some like roles that he says that people have in communities. And I don't really want to get into that because that would take us much longer. But I think it is important to notice like what I get and give in particular relationships, like with you, doing the podcast and working with you, Chris. Like, what are you and I doing for each other that makes it so that we get to grow our capacity to be who we want to be? And I'll refer back to the book Joyful Militancy and say, I want everyone to read it. It's such a beautiful book about why we need each other for like to have joy, and that joy is increasing our capacity to do more in the world.
Yeah, and also as you're talking, particularly toward the end, where what you said, relating to your relational nature, I am brought back to something that something you're already aware of, something that I was introduced to newly as of last year, which is the concept of micro solidarity. And we'll put this link in the show notes here. This organization that talks about micro solidarity presents what they call a quote fractal view of belonging. And in that fractal view, they present a couple of different elements. They present this concept of the self, or what some people might call the individual. And then there's a partnership concerned with and containing two selves. And then there's a crew, which can contain individual selves as well as partnerships. And then they have the congregation composed of crews and partnerships and selves and so on and so forth. And when I look at this diagram, it reminds me that this idea of identity, at least for me, does not have to be limited to me as this one physical body, in somehow in complete distinction or separation from everything. Actually, let me distinguish between distinction and separation. I do believe there is such a thing as the self, and such a thing as the individual. But so yes, there is a distinction between, let's say, me as a self and me as who I am in relationship with my wife, for instance. But I don't necessarily believe in the idea of separation as such. And I'm not a philosopher, so I'll get all the terminology wrong. But I guess where I'm going with this is I'm trying to embrace more and more this idea of identity that is inherently relational. So in that sense, if I were in, let's say, solitary confinement, I would lose an aspect of my identity through the loss of those relationships. And I also see relationship as something that it's not just a noun, it's also a type of doing that we are relating to each other. So, in that sense, a relationship does not necessarily exist in the same way without the act of relating to somebody, at least on, some kind of regular basis. Um, I don't know, perhaps I'm at a loss. I'm at a loss for what I'm trying to grasp at. But in, shall we say, times like these, I have been doing little things that I would say are expressions of my identity in a relational way. And I might even dare to say in a communal way. So, of course, our conversations regularly are an example of that. I have reached out to people who say they're looking for jobs, which includes people I know who are very new to the federal government and were, I believe, unjustly terminated back in February. One of those people just recently received an announcement saying, hey, these terminations were ruled by a court to be unlawful. So you have your job back. Please return to the office, basically. So you can imagine all the churn and the just the mess. Obviously, this is not limited to the USA, but we've talked across this podcast now about some of the USA specific things going on, which is why I'm happy that in today's recording, we've been able to talk more broadly about community and being relational um, in a way that is, I think, very much related to what's happening in the USA, but is not strictly limited to it. And also in an earlier episode, just to re-acknowledge what you said in one of our first recordings, you did say that what is happening in the USA has affected people that you know personally in Colombia, who live in Colombia. And indeed, what's happening does have a global impact, not just through USAID, but through other vectors as well. So I've taken a long breath and said a lot, so I think I'm just going to pause there. And as we wrap up our recording, just wondering if you have any more reflections on community and a sense of self and relationship as something that's a verb and not just a noun. And all of this, of course, in the context of Peter Gelderloos's article.
Yeah, survival of identity. I mean, what you're saying about the work you've been doing lately with people and finding jobs. I wouldn't say that I have a profession, a career as such myself, but I know people who do, whose whole identity is probably tied up with the work they do. They love, it's a job that they care about, and it's in a particular field, and then to have that taken away, the trauma, around identity. People who um maybe could be a professor, and it's not a USAID issue, but a professor who then loses their job and isn't allowed to be a professor anymore. That could be, if that was their whole adult life, then that's an identity crisis, and that feels like survival. And so, yeah, I just think that I would love people to go away thinking about these questions like, why aren't we in community with the people that we depend on for our physical survival? Because most people, I think, who listen to this podcast probably aren't. Number two, where are our identities tied up with our relationships? And are some of these online? And does that make us vulnerable? It does. It does make us vulnerable when we're relying on like a global technology um, to ensure that our relationships continue. Yeah. And three, I guess, is what are our identities? Um, where are they vulnerable? Who do they depend upon? Yeah. It's left me with a lot to think about, and I appreciate, if I didn't wasn't able to be in this conversation with you, Chris, I wouldn't have even thought about these things. So it's like part of what I love about thinking and understanding more and increasing my own capacity is I do need these conversations with other people. So, Yeah, I'm I'm counting on you for my survival, Chris.
Yes, and I the same with you, Heather. And I think it very much seems like the questions we came into this conversation with have been perhaps multiplied tenfold as we're leaving. And I'm hoping also for our audience that the experience is the same as well, because I do think these types of questions of identity, of community, of relationships are important to take time and contemplate. For those, understandably, not everybody has the time or the ability to think through these. But I believe also, as things are happening so rapidly and are so unpredictable, the need to contemplate these types of questions and particularly ask, what do we really rely on? That need actually goes greater as the uncertainty becomes greater. So I'm certainly leaving with a lot to think about. And perhaps when we talk again, maybe next week, we will have even more to say.
Excellent. I look forward. I will save a hot chocolate for that.
And I, some almond milk flavored with coffee.
Oh, it sounds so good. All right. Take care.
Take care. Until next time. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
You have been listening to Morning Tinto with Heather Luna and Chris Musay Sequeira. Each time we record, we use the news of the day to be as freshly brewed as possible. So subscribe, follow along, and comment if you can. Let us know what you think, and we will talk to you soon. Bye bye.